In June of 1889, a cabinet maker named John Back left a pot of glue boiling on his stove. He stepped out for a few minutes. When he came back, the glue had overflowed onto the woods havings on his floor. The floor caught, the wall caught, and within 6 hours, 25 city blocks of downtown Seattle were gone. The Great Seattle Fire killed no one, but it erased almost everything the city had built since 1852. $32 million in property. Warehouses, hotels, saloons, offices, homes, all of it ash. What happened next is the part they don't tell you in school. Because Seattle didn't just rebuild, Seattle made a decision, a specific, calculated, economically motivated decision. And that decision buried an entire city underground. Literally. The original ground floor of Seattle, the streets people walked on, the storefronts merchants ran, the underground networks that kept the city alive, all of it still exists. Right now, beneath your feet, preserved in near-perfect darkness since 1907. But here's the part that matters. This wasn't an accident of history. This was a real estate play. To understand what actually happened, you have to go back before the fire. Back to when Seattle was a city that couldn't figure out how to handle its own waste. Seattle was built on a tidal flat. The original town site sat just barely above sea level, which meant that every time the tide came in, the city's rudimentary sewage system ran backward. Raw sewage backed up into the streets, into the basements, into the water supply. By the late 1880s, Seattle had a typhoid problem, a cholera problem, and a smell that visitors described as catastrophic. The city's population was exploding thanks to the railroad, and the infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of it. City engineers had been arguing for years about what to do. The obvious answer was regrades. Seattle sat at the base of a series of steep hills. If you could shave those hills down and use the fill to raise the tidal flats up by 20, maybe 22 feet in some places, you could create proper drainage. The water would flow away from the city instead of into it. The sewage problem would solve itself. But regrades cost money. Property owners resisted. The city council couldn't agree. And so nothing happened. Seattle kept growing, kept smelling, and kept getting sick. Then John Back left his glue on the stove. The fire gutted downtown in a single afternoon. And in one of the stranger moments in American urban history, city leaders looked at the smouldering wreckage and made a decision that would have been politically impossible the day before. They were going to raise the streets, all of them, the entire downtown core, by up to 22 feet. Here's where the economic history gets interesting. When the announcement was made, property owners panicked. Their buildings were already gone. Now the city was telling them the ground itself would be different by the time they could rebuild. If you put up a new building at the old street level, your first floor would eventually sit below the new road. Your entrance would be in a hole. Your windows would look out at people's ankles. Most owners chose to wait, but some didn't. Some rebuilt immediately at the old grade, betting they could adapt later. And this is where the underground city actually comes from. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a subway or a utility corridor or a deliberate preservation project. It was the result of hundreds of individual property owners making different bets about timing, and the city raising the streets around them anyway. The regrading itself was an extraordinary feat of civic engineering for its era. Horse-drawn scrapers and early hydraulic equipment were used to blast apart the hills surrounding downtown. The fill was moved block by block, sometimes over the course of years. Retaining walls went up on either side of newly elevated streets, leaving the existing building entrances stranded below. In some blocks, the elevation difference was gradual. In others, you could stand at street level and look straight down into what had been the first floor of a functioning business less than a decade before. Merchants on those transitional blocks improvised wooden bridges, ladders and planks to get from the new sidewalks down to their own front doors. The city did not compensate them for the inconvenience. The city did not consider it an inconvenience. The city considered it progress. By the time the regrades were complete, a significant portion of old downtown Seattle had been swallowed. The original sidewalks became the ceilings of underground walkways. The original storefronts, with their counters and shelving and back rooms still intact, became subterranean chambers. The original streets, where horse-drawn wagons had rattled through mud and horse manure, became a kind of buried archaeological layer. All of it sealed off, one block at a time, as the new city rose above it. For a while, people actually used the underground. There were interconnected passages running for blocks. Shop owners had hatches in their floors that opened down into the old level. Deliveries came through underground corridors. Some of the old spaces were rented out. Some were converted into storage, and some, predictably, became something else entirely. Seattle in the 1890s and early 1900s had one of the most active vice economies on the West Coast. The underground was perfect for it. Opium dens operated below street level, invisible to police unless someone specifically climbed down to look. Gambling rooms moved underground when heat came from above. Prostitution, which had always been part of Seattle's economic fabric going back to the city's founding, found new geography in the old storefronts below the new streets. The scale of the underground vice economy is difficult to fully document, because documentation was the one thing its operators were careful to avoid. What historians have pieced together from police records, newspaper accounts, and the occasional city council investigation suggests that by the late 1890s the underground had become a parallel commercial district running beneath legitimate downtown Seattle. Certain brothels maintained two tiers of operation, one above ground for the official record and one below for the actual business. Certain saloons used the underground passages to receive shipments that bypassed the excise inspector entirely. The underground wasn't chaos, it was organized. Someone was collecting rent, someone was managing logistics, and whoever was managing logistics had connections at City Hall, because the raids that occasionally swept through never quite managed to arrive when anyone important was present. The city tolerated this for years, partly because the economy depended on it, partly because the underground was genuinely difficult to police, and partly because the men who owned the buildings above ground were often the same men profiting from the tenants below it. But by 1907, the underground was sealed. The official reason was public health. Bubonic plague had been discovered in San Francisco, and Seattle's health officials were terrified of a repeat. The underground was full of rats. The passages were dark, wet, and unmapped. The city ordered them closed, bricked up the entrances, and the original Seattle disappeared. What stayed behind was remarkable, because the underground hadn't been stripped. It hadn't been flooded or burned or demolished. It had just been sealed. Now, the counters were still there. The fixtures were still attached to the walls. The original skylights, which had once opened up to street level and now opened up to the underside of a new sidewalk, were still intact. 80 years of accumulated debris, yes. But underneath the debris, the city of 1889 was essentially frozen in place. Nobody thought much about this for the next 50 years. Seattle grew upward and outward. The underground became urban legend, the kind of thing old-timers mentioned to newcomers usually after a few drinks. Then in 1965, a journalist and local historian named Bill Speidel decided to take people down there. Speidel wasn't just curious about history, he was trying to stop the city from tearing down Pioneer Square. Seattle in the 1960s, like most American cities of that era, had caught the urban renewal fever. Old buildings were coming down all over downtown. Pioneer Square, the original commercial core that had been rebuilt after the 1889 fire, was slated for demolition. The argument was that it was a slum, that the buildings were too old, too dilapidated, and that the land would be better used for parking lots and modern development. The urban renewal logic was the same logic that had governed the regrade decades earlier. Older, lower-value uses of land were going to be displaced by newer, higher-value ones. The difference was that in 1965 there were people who recognized the pattern and decided to fight it. Speidel was one of them. He understood that the only argument that could beat a redevelopment plan was a more compelling story about what was already there. Speidel's underground tours were, in part, a preservation argument made physical. If you could take people underground and show them that the original city was still there, that Seattle had history worth keeping, maybe they'd vote differently. Maybe the demolition could be stopped. It worked. The tours became enormously popular. People were genuinely astonished to walk through storefronts from 1889, to stand in rooms that hadn't seen light in 60 years, to look up through the original skylights and see the frosted glass that had once let sunlight into a pharmacy or a hardware store. The underground became the argument that saved Pioneer Square. Seattle designated it a historic district in 1970, one of the first cities in the country to do so. But Speidel's contribution goes beyond preservation. His 1966 book about the underground and Seattle's early history, Sons of the Prophets, is one of the more subversive local histories ever written. The title is blunt. It was a book about greed, about the specific men who made specific decisions to enrich themselves at public expense, and about how those decisions shaped the city. Speidel wasn't interested in the heroic founding father narrative. He was interested in who actually benefited from the fire, from the regrades, from the underground vice economy, and from the real estate boom that followed. The answer, in almost every case, was a small group of landowners who had positioned themselves correctly before the crisis hit. Arthur Denny, often called the founder of Seattle, owned significant parcels in the regrade zone. Henry Yesler, whose sawmill had been one of the first major industries in the city, owned land that became dramatically more valuable once the streets were raised. The men who sat on the city council during the rebuilding period were, with very few exceptions, the same men who stood to gain the most from how the rebuilding was structured. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just what urban development looks like when you strip away the civic mythology. Cities make decisions about infrastructure and land use that are always, on some level, decisions about who gets rich. The Seattle Regrade was framed as a public health initiative, and it genuinely did solve the sewage problem. But it also transferred enormous value to landowners who had the capital to rebuild quickly at the new grade at the expense of smaller property owners who couldn't afford to wait or adapt. The underground city is the physical record of that transfer. The spaces that got swallowed were disproportionately the spaces owned by people who didn't have the resources to respond to the regrade quickly enough. The spaces that rose above were owned by people who did. Walk through the Seattle Underground today and your guide will tell you about the skylights, about the old saloons, about the rats and the opium dens and the colourful characters of early Seattle. All of that is true and worth knowing. But what you're also walking through is an architectural record of an economic event, a physical document of who won and who lost when the city rewrote its own ground level. The 22-foot raise wasn't just an engineering project. It was a redistribution of urban value, executed under the cover of a public health crisis, by the people who controlled the levers of city government. That pattern, the manufactured urgency, the infrastructure project that solves a real problem while also solving a real estate problem, did not begin in Seattle and did not end there. What makes Seattle unusual is that the evidence is still underground. You can walk through it. You can stand in the original first floor of a building that the city effectively confiscated by raising the street above it. You can look up through the skylight and see the modern sidewalk overhead and understand, in a way that no textbook quite captures, what it means for a city to reinvent itself on top of its own past. There's one more thing worth knowing. The underground still isn't fully explored. Speidel's tours, which still run today under the name Bill Speidel's Underground Tour, cover about a block and a half of the original network. The rest is still down there. Some of it has been excavated by archaeologists. Some of it is incorporated into the basements of buildings that went up after 1907. And some of it is just sealed, the way it was sealed over 100 years ago, full of whatever was left behind when the city bricked up the doors and walked away. Most cities erase their inconvenient histories. They demolish the buildings, pave the lots, name a park after the people who did the erasing, and call it civic progress. Seattle did something different, not out of conscience, but out of circumstance. The underground survived because sealing it was cheaper than excavating it. The record survived because one stubborn journalist decided the story was worth telling. The neighborhood survived because a community organized before the bulldozers arrived. What you're left with is a city where you can literally descend into the decisions that built it, where the economic logic of 1889 is preserved in brick and timber 22 feet below the street, where the people who lost are represented not by monuments but by the empty rooms that were their livelihood, swallowed whole when the money moved upward. The tour guides don't usually frame it this way. The official narrative is warmer. It talks about resilience, reinvention, the pioneer spirit. Those things aren't wrong. Seattle did rebuild quickly. The new city was by most measures better than the one that burned. Cleaner, better drained, more rationally laid out. The people who benefited most from the regrade weren't cartoonish villains. They were opportunists operating inside a system that rewarded exactly what they did. But the families who lost their shops to the rising streets were real too. Their names aren't on any plaques. Their buildings are the ones you walk through on the underground tour, preserved not as monuments but as evidence. Evidence that every city has a version of this story, a moment when the official account of progress and the actual account of who paid for it diverge sharply. Seattle is unusual only in that you can go underground and see exactly where the gap is. Seattle raised itself 22 feet and called it progress. What it left underneath was the invoice.